I'm a 26-year-old woman, and this story begins 16 years ago, when I was 10 and standing by my mother's grave. Everything felt cold. Too quiet for a funeral. Too quick to be real. I remember holding onto the sleeves of my dress and waiting for someone to tell me what to do. My father didn't want me to sit in the front row. He said it was for the adults. So I sat alone in the back, watching strangers cry harder than I did. When we got to the cemetery, I finally broke down. I was standing near the headstone, crying so hard I could barely breathe. A woman I didn't recognize came up behind me. She put her hand on my shoulder and leaned in close. "Don't cry," she whispered. "It makes people uncomfortable." I didn't answer. I just stared at the dirt. That was Lisa, my father's friend. I hadn't seen her before, but she acted like she belonged there. 3 months later, they were married. No big wedding. No announcement. One morning I woke up and she was in the kitchen making pancakes like she had always lived there. The bedroom my mother used to sleep in with my dad now had Lisa's clothes in the closet. The scent of my mother's perfume was gone. The picture of her on the hallway table was missing. I found it later in a plastic storage bin in the garage underneath piles of books and half-used cleaning products. The bin next to it had my mother's wedding dress stuffed into a black garbage bag. When I asked my dad why, he just said Lisa didn't want shrines to the past in the house. He made me delete every photo of my mom from the living room wall. He said it was time to move on. Lisa didn't waste time pretending. She introduced herself at my school as my mother. I found out when a teacher asked me if I was okay with my mom attending the parent conference. I said she wasn't my mother. The teacher looked confused. That same week, I came home to find Lisa wearing my mother's necklace. It had a gold locket with a tiny picture of me as a baby. She wore it like it belonged to her. I stopped speaking to her except when I had to. When she told me to call her mom, I refused. She said I was being difficult and that I needed to grow up. She called it adjustment issues. I called it pretending. The first Mother's Day after everything, Lisa threw a lunch party. She invited her own mother, set up the dining room, played music. I was the only one in the house not celebrating. I stayed in my room. When she came to get me, I said I didn't want to be part of it. She told me to stop moping around and said her mother deserved to be celebrated, even if mine didn't. By then, I had started writing in journals. Every night after school, I would take 20 minutes to just write down everything. The things Lisa said, the changes in the house, what I remembered about my mom. No one knew about the journals. I kept them in a box under my bed. One day in 7th grade, I refused to go home. I sat outside the school gate and waited until the building closed. The principal called my father, who was furious. I ended up sitting with the school counselor for an hour. She was the first adult who didn't brush things off. I saw her once a week after that. Lisa wasn't happy. She said I was painting her as some kind of monster. She started checking my bedroom when I wasn't home. I moved the journals to my locker. By the time I turned 16, Lisa had gone from cold to controlling. She didn't like it when I missed family dinners, didn't answer her calls or locked my door. On her birthday, I didn't show up to the restaurant. I had told my dad I had a project and couldn't come. When I got home that night, Lisa was waiting. She slapped me across the face before I could take my shoes off. I left the next morning. My aunt, my mom's sister, had offered me a room years ago. I finally said yes. I packed 2 duffel bags and never looked back. My father didn't call, not even once. Lisa told the rest of the family I had emotional problems, that I was acting out for attention. Some believed her, some didn't. But no one came to check. I stayed with my aunt through the rest of high school and into college. She gave me the kind of space that felt safe. She never asked too many questions, just made sure I had what I needed. When I turned 18, she handed me a small box. It had a necklace in it, the twin to the one my mom used to wear. My mom had given it to her years ago. Just in case that necklace is still with me. I wear it the hard days. This story isn't about grief. Not anymore. It's about everything that came after. It's about the life I built on the ashes Lisa thought she could sweep away. It's about why she cries now every time someone says my name. Not because I broke her heart, but because she finally knows what it's like to be invisible. 2 months ago, I got engaged to Joshua. He's steady in a way that calms rooms, kind with his actions, not just his words. He met my aunt before he met me. She was his college professor, and she introduced us during a holiday dinner. We've been together for 3 years, and we're planning a fall wedding. Small guest list, outdoor venue, no chaos. From the very beginning, I didn't plan to invite my father or Lisa. I made that decision without hesitation. But when I told my aunt, she asked if I was sure. She said weddings bring up emotions, and maybe this was a chance for closure. I told her I'd think about it, even though I already knew the answer. Instead of sending them invitations, I mailed them a simple wedding card. Just a card with the date and location printed on it. No RSVP request, no formal invite. It was information, not an invitation. A week later, I got a call from an unknown number. I didn't answer. Then a message came through. It said, "You're still ungrateful. We'll be attending." I hadn't spoken to either of them in years. They weren't part of my life, and now they were planning to crash the most important day of it. Joshua and I sat down and discussed it that night. He suggested we hire security, and I agreed. We made sure the venue would have guest list verification at the front gate. Only names on the final list would be allowed in. No exceptions. Then I got a Facebook message. It was from Olivia, Lisa's daughter, my stepsister. Technically. Though we were never close, Lisa always made sure she stayed out of my way. When we were kids, we lived in the same house but moved like shadows past each other. Olivia wrote, "I think you should talk to my mom. She's been crying every night." I didn't respond right away. Olivia kept messaging, saying Lisa was in pain, that she wanted to talk, that maybe we could find some way to make peace before the wedding. I finally wrote back and told her no. I didn't owe Lisa anything. Olivia said Lisa wanted to give a speech at the wedding. That was the last straw. I blocked her. I hadn't blocked anyone before, but I wasn't going to let her push in on my boundaries. After that, I never heard from her again. My aunt got a call later that week from my father. He asked her to talk to me. Said he was worried I was letting emotions get in the way of family. She told him I had made my choice and that I didn't want contact. He didn't take it well. The next day, I received an email from my father, 5 pages long. He wrote about how we used to be a family, how Lisa helped raise me, how I was throwing away history. He said I couldn't erase what we had just because I didn't like how it ended. Attached to the email were old photos. Lisa holding me as a child, helping me decorate a birthday cake, standing behind me in what looked like a Halloween costume contest. I didn't remember most of those moments. I definitely didn't remember smiling in any of them. I deleted the email without replying. I brought it up in therapy the same week. I didn't read the email word for word. I just summarized it and said it felt like someone trying to rewrite a past I didn't agree to. My therapist asked me what I wanted from this wedding. I said I wanted peace. Not performance, not reconciliation, just peace. A few days later, I went to a dress shop with my aunt and found the one. It wasn't flashy or expensive. It was simple, white with lace on the sleeves and a clean skirt that fell to the ground. I had brought a picture of my mother's wedding dress with me, one I found years ago, folded inside a photo album my aunt had kept. I showed it to the woman at the store and asked if she could help me find something close. She smiled and said, "We can do even better." That was the dress I chose. We sent the final guest to the venue the same night. Joshua double-checked that everything was secure. The name screening was strict. Anyone not on the list wouldn't even be allowed past the parking lot. That same weekend, I got a message from one of my old high school friends. She told me she ran into Lisa at a pharmacy. Lisa had asked if she was going to my wedding. When she said no, Lisa apparently looked surprised and said, "I thought Clara would want us there." I didn't respond to that either, but I started a new entry in my journal that night. I wrote down everything that had happened from the moment I mailed the card. I stapled the text message to the back of the page. It reminded me that boundaries without enforcement are just suggestions. The dress is now hanging in the spare bedroom of my aunt's house, zipped in its bag. My aunt ordered a small bouquet of white wildflowers to go with it, the same ones my mother carried when she married my father. I chose them because I remember the picture. My mother looked like herself in that moment. Real present. This time I want to walk down the aisle with someone who knows the whole story, every part of it, and no one standing in the back trying to rewrite it. Last weekend, my cousin Ellie hosted a small backyard reunion. Nothing formal, just grilled food, plastic chairs, and folding tables set up under string lights. She texted me, saying it was a chill gathering for our side of the family. I almost didn't go, but she had always been kind, and with the wedding getting close, I figured it would be nice to catch up with the people who actually showed up for me. I pulled up around 6 in the evening, parked 2 houses down since the driveway was already full. As I walked through the side gate, I could hear music playing. Low enough not to bother neighbors, loud enough to mask awkward silences. The moment I stepped into the backyard, my eyes locked on the patio set near the fence. My father was sitting there with a drink in his hand, and beside him, Lisa Ellie was already halfway to me. Moving fast, she whispered, "They just showed up. Said they wanted to congratulate you." I didn't think they'd actually come. I nodded, but my feet felt stuck. Most of the guests were already seated and halfway through their plates. Walking out would have made things worse, so I kept moving toward the buffet table like nothing had happened. Lisa stood up when she saw me. Her eyes welled up and she smiled too wide. I didn't stop. I walked past her and went straight to my aunt, who had no idea they were there either. I gave her a hug, picked up a plate, and sat beside my cousin on the far side of the lawn. My father came over 5 minutes later and tried to hug me. I took a step back and told him I wasn't comfortable. "Oh, in." He looked caught off guard but didn't push it. Lisa lingered behind him, watching the exchange. She didn't sit down again for a while during dinner. Lisa kept looking at me. Not staring, but glancing every few seconds like she was studying me. At one point she leaned across the table and said, "You look so much like her now." I didn't answer. I turned to my cousin on the right and asked her about her new job. Lisa tried a few more times to make conversation. I kept redirecting. Eventually, she got the message. When the plates were cleared, I waited until people started moving toward dessert and games. Then I stood up and made my way to the side gate. I didn't look back when I stepped through that gate, not even when I heard Lisa's voice behind me say my name so softly it could have been a breeze or a memory, and maybe that's what she wanted, to blur the difference, but I kept walking, my hands clenched too tight to wave, my throat too thick to speak, because what I had carried for 16 years wasn't something you put down in a backyard over paper plates and sweet tea, and I knew, deep in my gut, that if I turned around, I'd be pulled back into the performance they had always insisted was love, rewritten over silence and control and shame, so I didn't give them the satisfaction, didn't let them see the tears that started to well in the car, hot and angry, not from regret but from the ache of finally realizing that even now, they believed they were entitled to access me, to moments of my life, to my peace, just because they were there when I was small and voiceless and grieving, just because they thought proximity counted as parenting. But proximity without empathy is just surveillance, and that's all it ever was, their version of care, watching closely enough to keep me quiet but never close enough to keep me whole, and I knew then, as clearly as I knew anything, that the wedding wasn't just a celebration, it was an end point, a border wall, a drawn line in the ground that said this far, no further, and they couldn't stand that I had built it without them, that I had grown without asking their permission, so when I got home that night, still in the dress I had worn to the backyard gathering, I sat at the kitchen table in the dark with a pen in my hand and opened the notebook I had once buried at the back of a drawer, the one with a list of things Lisa said that I was too young to understand or too sensitive to handle. I reread it, every word, and then added more, tried to hug me after a decade of silence, said I looked like her, meaning my mother, like that was supposed to be a compliment instead of a theft, showed up uninvited again, and I didn't stop writing until my fingers cramped and the page curled slightly under the pressure of the pen, and when I looked down, I realized I wasn't shaking with anger, I was still, calm in a way I didn't recognize at first, like I'd finally broken the spell they had cast so early, the one where their version of events held more weight than mine, and the next morning, when I told Joshua what had happened, he didn't flinch, he just nodded, wrapped his arms around me and said, "They won't touch our day," and I believed him, not because he promised control, but because he understood boundaries the way people like Lisa never could, not as punishment, but as healing, as architecture for peace, and that night, we emailed the venue again just to confirm the gate list, reviewed at every access point, double-checked security, not because we were afraid of conflict, but because we were done with ambushes, done with guilt dressed up as family, done with being polite in the face of people who had never extended us the same courtesy, and in therapy later that week, I told my counselor everything, from Lisa's long stares to the forced smile, to the way my father said nothing when she spoke like the ghost of my mother wasn't still in the room, and when my therapist asked how I felt, I said it was like someone had thrown a party in a burned-down house and expected me to bring dessert, and she smiled gently, nodded, and said, "Then it's time to rebuild somewhere else," and that phrase stuck, lodged in my chest like a key to something I hadn't opened yet, because for the first time I understood that boundaries weren't walls to keep people out, they were doors to let myself in, and for years, I had lived outside my own story, watching it from a distance as Lisa rewrote it with cleaner lines and brighter lighting, erasing every moment that made her uncomfortable and calling it healing, but I was done healing on their terms, done being quiet so other people didn't feel guilty, done pretending Lisa was just misguided instead of methodical, and the truth was, when I had cried at my mother's grave, it wasn't just grief, it was confusion, betrayal, because even at 10, I knew something was wrong about the way the world moved on without her, about the way Lisa slipped in like a replacement, about how fast everything familiar was boxed up or thrown away or buried, and I had spent 16 years trying to make sense of that erasure, trying to be the kind of daughter no one could call ungrateful, even as I swallowed every memory she stole and wore like it was hers, but I didn't know her gratitude, not for pancakes, not for fake smiles, not for the kind of control that looked like care from the outside but felt like prison from within, and when I said no to her message, when I blocked Olivia, when I ignored the email from my father, I wasn't being vindictive, I was reclaiming silence, reshaping it into protection, and that weekend, I took the journal, the copies of their messages, the old photos he sent me, and placed them into a locked box, labeled it witness, not because I needed to remember, but because I deserved to know I wasn't imagining any of it, and when I zipped the bag around my dress the next day and touched the wildflower bouquet hanging to dry near the window, I didn't think of Lisa or my father or even the girl I used to be. I thought of my mother, the real one, the one whose absence never diminished her presence, the one whose silence was never cruel, only unfinished, and I whispered a promise I hadn't known I was holding in my chest. I will not disappear like they wanted me to. I will not be rewritten. I will walk into this new life with both hands open, memory intact, heart steady, and for once, not as someone mourning what was stolen, but as someone claiming what was always mine, the right to live loudly, without apology. The letter arrived 4 days after the backyard encounter, not handwritten but typed, centered, formatted like something official, as if Lisa thought using clean fonts and structured paragraphs could mask what it really was, a final attempt at control disguised as peacekeeping, printed on expensive paper and folded with care like a threat dressed in politeness, and I knew the moment I held it in my hands that it wasn't meant for reconciliation, it was a weapon designed to look like a gift, because that's what she was best at, confusing harm with help, making manipulation feel like motherhood. And as I read through her words, sentences like "you'll always be family whether you like it or not, and I know you're hurting, but that doesn't give you the right to erase the people who raised you." I didn't cry, didn't rage, I just sat there feeling a kind of numb certainty that this was never going to end with an apology, not a real one, because Lisa didn't believe she had done anything wrong. She believed she had absorbed me, claimed me like a photo she once framed but never looked at, and what terrified her wasn't that I had rejected her, it was that I had rejected the version of myself she had worked so hard to design, the one that was grateful, quiet, damaged but manageable. And when I set the letter down, I knew I needed to go deeper, not for her, but for me. So I asked my aunt if I could see my mother's things again, the ones she had stored years ago in plastic tubs in her attic, labeled Marina in my mother's handwriting, slanted and neat, still intact like a voice frozen in ink. And we spent an afternoon unsealing the past, baby clothes, birthday cards, old jewelry, and at the very bottom, a bundle of letters bound with ribbon, each one addressed to Clara. And for a moment, I couldn't breathe, because I didn't know if I was ready to hear from her. Not after everything, not after so much silence, but my hands moved before I could talk myself out of it, and I opened the first letter, undated. Unsigned, written in my mother's voice, describing her first year of motherhood, the fears, the awe, the exhaustion, the way she would sometimes just sit beside my crib and whisper promises I wouldn't remember, things like "I'll never let you feel alone in this house and you will never have to earn love in this family." And I realized that every word Lisa had spoken to rewrite history, every email my father had sent to make their choices seem noble, every photo of forced smiles and fake milestones they had shoved in my face was no match for this, for truth told in handwriting, for the way my mother's words rang louder than any performance Lisa could stage. And I kept reading, one letter after another, tracing the evolution of a woman who had loved deeply, who had worried about dying young, who had written once, "If something happens to me, promise me she won't be erased." And the grief hit me then, sharp and clean like broken glass, not for her death. I had mourned that 1,000 times. But for the betrayal of that promise, for the way my father had let someone sweep away her scent, her photo, her voice, for the way I had spent my life being told that remembering her was selfish, that clinging to her was an obstacle instead of a right. And that night I opened my laptop and wrote a document with one word at the top, timeline, and I began writing everything down, not for court, not for revenge, but for clarity, a complete and unflinching record of what was taken, what was denied, what was buried. And I included Lisa's letters, her Facebook messages, the slap, the lies, the day I found the wedding dress in a trash bag, the photo of my mother's locket around Lisa's neck, and every time someone told me I was being dramatic, being bitter, being ungrateful, and when I was done, it felt like a blueprint of survival, not just mine, but my mother's too. Her memory lifted from the margins and set at the center where it had always belonged, and Joshua read every word without speaking, his eyes quiet with respect, and when he finished, he took my hand and said, "This is the kind of truth that makes room for the future," and we printed the document and sealed it in a folder titled Witness, Marina and Clara, and I didn't feel weighed down by it, I felt lighter, like finally naming what had happened had loosened its grip on me. And days later, when Lisa sent a follow-up email with the subject line, "Are we really ending things this way?" I didn't open it, didn't even click. I moved it straight to a folder labeled unopened, because not every confrontation deserves attention, not every story needs a sequel. And when my father followed up with a call, I let it ring, watched his name on the screen like it was a stranger, because the man who raised me had made a choice, not just once, but every time he let Lisa speak over me, every time he looked away while she rewrote my life in her image, and I no longer needed his approval to grieve or to move forward. And that week I bought a new frame, a simple wooden one, and placed inside it the last page of one of my mother's letters, a line I will never forget: "You are not made of their silence. You are made of mine." And I hung it above my writing desk, not as a shrine, but as a signal that the story was mine now, not theirs to edit, not theirs to interrupt. And every time I walk past it, I don't think of loss, I think of language, of how I found my voice not in spite of her absence, but because I refused to let it be final. It started subtly, like all of Lisa's intrusions, not a direct attack, but a shadow stretching slowly across the edges of things I hadn't invited her into, the way she always operated, pushing past soft lines until she could pretend she didn't see them at all. And the first sign was a text from an old classmate I hadn't spoken to in years, someone I barely remembered but who apparently still lived in our hometown, who messaged me out of the blue to say she ran into Lisa at a grocery store and that Lisa had mentioned she wasn't sure if she was allowed at the wedding, but that she and my father would probably still make the trip just in case. And the casualness of it made my stomach twist, not because I was surprised, but because it confirmed what I had suspected all along, that the card I sent wasn't just seen as ambiguous, it was interpreted as a loophole, an opening to push through. And I knew then, without question, that I couldn't rely on good faith or assumed boundaries, not with them. Not ever. So I reached out to our wedding planner and asked her to walk me through every entrance, every gate, every possible way someone could slip into the ceremony without clearance. And she was patient, methodical, told me we could set up 2 layers of verification if needed, name lists at the road entrance, and wristbands at the venue gate. And I said yes to all of it, not because I wanted a fortress, but because I needed to stop flinching every time I opened my inbox, needed to know that peace wasn't something I just hoped for, it was something I built. And still, it didn't stop there, because a few days later my cousin called to say Lisa had reached out to her on Instagram, asking if she was excited to celebrate Clara and how involved she was in the bridal party, and it was so rehearsed, so clearly manipulative, like Lisa was collecting witnesses, trying to position herself as someone gracious and heartbroken, someone hurt by being excluded but still loving, still present. It was the same act she had always used to convince people that I was the problem, the bitter one, the ungrateful one, and I realized, again, that this wasn't about the wedding. It was about her narrative slipping, about her losing the role she cast herself in all those years ago. Mother figure, grieving wife, savior of a lost little girl, and if she couldn't control me anymore, she needed to at least control the story. And that night I sat with Joshua at the dining room table, our guest list open between us, and we began making final cuts, not out of spite but clarity, removing every person who had wavered, who had tried to play neutral when there was no neutral ground to stand on, who had told me they understood both sides as if grief and gaslighting could share a stage, and with every name we crossed off, I felt the ceremony becoming something smaller, tighter, realer, like I was finally building a life that reflected my truth instead of someone else's fiction. And when my father emailed again, this time just a single sentence, "This is going to destroy our family," I stared at it for a long time, thinking about how many times that word had been used as a weapon instead of a bond. And I didn't reply, I just archived the message and added a note to my journal. Their idea of family was never mine. And the following weekend, we held the final rehearsal at the venue, walking through the steps slowly, pausing at the aisle as the planner explained how the seating would be arranged, and I stood there for a moment longer than I needed to, staring at the rows of empty chairs, imagining what it would look like when they were filled, not by people who had tolerated me, but by those who had chosen me, who knew the full story and still stood beside me. And when the planner asked if I had any preferences for the first song, I told her I wanted something without lyrics, something instrumental and steady, because this wasn't about performance, it was about presence. And later that night, back at home, I received one last message, this time from a number I didn't recognize, and it simply said, "I hope one day you realize I loved you like you were mine." And I didn't even need to guess. It was Lisa, of course it was, because that's how she operated, passive and loaded, never apologizing but always angling for a reaction. And I sat on the edge of the bed with the phone in my hand, thinking about all the things I could say, all the ways I could lay out the truth one more time, but I didn't type anything, didn't engage. I just blocked the number and put the phone face down on the table, and I felt something shift inside me. Not release, not joy, but something quieter, something like resolve, because boundaries only work if we maintain them when it's hard, when it's lonely, when the people who violated them cry foul. And I remembered something my therapist had said weeks ago, people who lose access to your life will always call it abandonment when what they really lost was power. That night, I opened the closet where my dress hung, untouched, pristine, zipped in a soft garment bag, and I laid my hand over the fabric like a promise, and I said aloud, not to Lisa, not to my father, not even to my mother, but to myself, they don't get it to be the loudest part of this day. I do. And for the first time in my life, I believed it. The morning of the wedding arrived with a strange quiet, not the kind that precedes something going wrong, but the kind that feels like a held breath before an exhale, the kind that's earned, and I woke before the sun, not to anxiety but to stillness, the real kind, where nothing is chasing you, and I sat in the small guest room of my aunt's house, the place I had once arrived with 2 duffel bags and a swollen cheek, now filled with pressed flowers and soft music and the faint scent of lavender oil she had diffused to calm my nerves. Though I didn't feel nervous, I felt ready, and not in a cliché way, not in the ready to be a bride way, but in the I know exactly who I am and what I've left behind way, in the this chapter is mine way. And when my aunt knocked softly and asked if I wanted tea, I smiled and said yes, because small rituals were sacred to me now, the quiet kindnesses, the moments where nothing needed to be earned. And we sat in her kitchen like it was just another Sunday, except my dress hung in the next room and the makeup artist would be here within the hour. And I didn't check my phone once, not because I was avoiding anything, but because for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop, it had already dropped, broken the floor, and been swept away, and now all that remained was the walk forward. So when the photographer arrived and began taking soft candids of the house, of my shoes by the door, of my aunt steaming the dress, of the necklace from my mother resting against the collarbone it was always meant to grace, I didn't pose, didn't stiffen, I just let it happen, like the moment had already been lived, and now I was simply catching up to it. And by the time I slipped into the dress, simple and elegant and a reflection of who I had become, not showy, not performative, just real, I could feel my heart beating not with fear, but with rhythm, with arrival. And when the car pulled up to take us to the venue, and I stepped into the late autumn light with my bouquet of wildflowers and a calmness I had never worn before, I knew that nothing, not a text, not an uninvited guest, not a memory in disguise, could touch what I had built, not today, because this day was barricaded by truth and protected by the people who had earned a place in its frame. And when we arrived, the gates were already closed, the name list tight, the security light but firm, and as guests arrived, smiling, warm, carrying joy instead of baggage, I stood inside the small green room with Joshua's jacket draped over the back of a chair. And then I thought of my mother, not with pain, but with clarity, the kind that knows absence is not the opposite of presence, but sometimes its sharpest form, and I whispered thank you, just once, and felt her hand in mine like memory instead of ghost. And when the music began, the soft instrumental I had chosen, no lyrics, no flash, just movement, I stepped outside, and there was the aisle, lined with chairs, everyone filled by someone who had stood in my storm and never asked me to smile through it. And I took that first step, Alone by choice, because walking myself down the aisle wasn't about isolation, it was about reclamation, about saying I arrived here by surviving everything they said I'd break under, and as I walked, I didn't look left or right too long, just forward, and at the end was Joshua, standing like stillness made human, and when we locked eyes, I knew this wasn't just a wedding, it was a line drawn in permanent ink between what had happened to me and what would happen next, and halfway down, I saw my aunt wiping a tear and smiling like she'd known this day would come even when I hadn't, and I saw Ellie beside her, already holding my phone because she knew I wouldn't want to touch it today, and I saw no one else from the life I had left behind, not my father, not Lisa, no second chances disguised as apologies, because they weren't invited, not just to the wedding, but to the person I had become, and when I reached the altar and took Joshua's hand, my fingers didn't shake, and as the officiant began, my mind didn't wander, and as I looked out at the faces of the people who had loved me without requirement, I thought, this is how you inherit your own name, not from the ones who gave it to you, but from the ones who taught you how to wear it without shame, and when the vows came, and I spoke my truth with a voice I hadn't always had access to, I said not only what I promised him, but what I promised myself, that I would never again shrink to fit someone else's comfort, never again silence myself to keep someone else's peace, never again offer grace where there was only manipulation, and as we kissed, as the crowd clapped, as the music swelled into something bigger and brighter, I felt every ghost leave me, every heavy room behind me collapse into nothing but memory, and as we walked back down the aisle, together this time, I didn't just feel like a bride, I felt like a survivor turned architect, someone who had taken ruins and built a home out of them, someone who knew that the aisle wasn't just a path, it was a reckoning, and now it was mine. The messages started again the morning after the wedding, not from Lisa this time, but from my father, and each one was shorter than the last, like he was trying to find the perfect balance between shame and guilt tripping. You didn't even say goodbye, your sister cried. I hope it was worth it, and I didn't respond, because it was worth it. Every second of that day was worth everything I had to cut loose to make it clean. And in the photos, the ones the photographer sent just 2 days later, I could see it in my face, something I'd never seen before, ease, like I belonged in the room I was standing in, like I wasn't flinching, wasn't scanning for threats, wasn't performing approval to survive it, just being, and it made the silence after the wedding feel like a blessing, a field finally clear of mines, and Joshua and I spent our short honeymoon tucked in a cottage near the coast, no social media, no updates, just walks and warm food and books read aloud in bed, and on the third night, I read him one of my mother's letters, one I hadn't read aloud before, one where she wrote, if anyone ever tries to rewrite you, remember I wrote you first, and his eyes softened and he took my hand and kissed my palm, and I knew, not guessed, not hoped, but knew, that I had ended something toxic and begun something real, and when we got back home, back to the life we'd built together, it was still quiet, and the stillness didn't scare me anymore, it felt earned, and one afternoon, I got a package in the mail, no return address, just my name in that same curling cursive I'd once seen on fake birthday cards Lisa used to send to my school to make herself look better, and I opened it, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't want to give it any power by fearing it, and inside was a journal, one I didn't recognize, black leather cover, gold-trimmed pages, and inside was a note that read, in case you wanted to tell the story differently, and for a second, I felt the cold, creeping thing again, the idea that maybe she really didn't understand, that maybe she thought this was still a two-way conflict, a difference in memory instead of a sustained dismantling of a child's grief, and I walked to the kitchen, lit a candle, and dropped the journal into a metal bowl I'd used during college for popcorn, and I watched the pages curl and blacken until the bowl filled with smoke, and I stood by the window while it burned, not crying, not angry, just done, and when it was ash, I emptied the bowl into the compost, like it had never existed, like all her chapters could rot somewhere new, and I sat down that night with my real journal, the one I'd started at 10, the one I'd hidden and carried and protected, and I wrote the final entry, not as a goodbye, but as a declaration, you don't get to speak over me anymore, and I closed the book and placed it next to my framed nursing license, my wedding photo, my mother's necklace resting in a small dish by the window, and then I felt the future open without a shadow inside it, and weeks later, I got one last piece of mail, this time addressed jointly to Joshua and me, a formal-looking envelope from an estate attorney in my father's city, and inside was a letter informing me that my father had listed me as next of kin and emergency contact despite our estrangement, and I called the office, calm, clear, and told them I was declining all involvement, told them to remove my name from anything forward-facing, that I had no intention of acting on his behalf or in his memory, and the woman on the phone paused and asked gently if I was sure, and I said, he had years to see me, he chose not to, and the silence on her end felt like agreement, and when the call ended, I didn't feel cruel, I felt clean, like I had finally learned what people mean when they say love doesn't mean tolerance, and forgiveness doesn't mean access, and family doesn't mean open door policy, and that evening, my aunt and I took a walk, just the two of us, and she told me something she hadn't said before, that when she found out Lisa had moved into our house so fast after my mom's death, she wanted to fight it, wanted to come get me, but didn't know how without making it worse, and that she'd lived with that guilt, and I stopped her and said, you gave me a safe place when I asked. But that's everything, and we both stood there, quiet under a canopy of leaves, and I felt something deep loosen, not in a broken way, but in a healing way, like a knot that finally untied itself after years of tension, and the next morning, I wrote one final list, not of who had hurt me, but of who had shown up, my aunt, Ellie, Joshua, my therapist, the teacher who asked if I was okay after Lisa introduced herself as my mother, the friend who sent screenshots when the messages started, the stranger at the bridal shop who said, "We can do better," and I titled the list Witnesses, because I realized I wasn't telling this story alone. It had been witnessed, believed, supported, and when I printed it out and taped it to the inside of my closet door, I felt like I had sealed something, not shut it away, but honored it. And months later, when I walked into the tiny bookstore that now carried a chapbook of personal essays I published under my name, I saw it, my name, Clara S. on a shelf, not hidden, not mocked, not revised by anyone else, and I stood there for a moment, no fanfare, no audience, just a quiet moment with my name, my story, my shelf, and I knew, this is what it means to end well. Not by forgetting. Not by forgiving what was never acknowledged. But by refusing to leave a seat for ghosts.